Under a frost-kissed Montana dawn, where tall grasses shimmer like scattered diamonds and ancient pines murmur forgotten secrets, something astonishing unfolded, something that challenged everything scientists thought they knew about wildlife. At 73 years old, Daphne Jenkins had dedicated her entire life to rescuing wildcats. Yet, nothing prepared her for the night when a mysterious visitor appeared outside her window. A rare, elusive bobcat that defied nature itself by seeking out human contact. But why had this wild creature, known for its fierce independence, returned after years in the wild? What secret bond linked this predator to an aging woman living alone at the edge of the forest? When scientists unraveled the truth behind their extraordinary connection, it shattered expectations and revealed a deeper, hidden world where compassion, memory, and nature intertwined in ways no one could have ever imagined. The Montana morning dawned crisp and clear, frost glittering on the tall grasses surrounding High Ridge Wildlife Sanctuary. Daphne Jenkins moved slowly these days, her 73-year-old bones protesting against the cold that seeped through her heavy wool coat. Still, she wouldn't have missed her morning rounds for anything. Every day, for the past 22 years, she'd walk the perimeter of the sanctuary, checking fences and surveying the landscape that had become her life's work. "Coffee's ready when you get back," called Miguel, her assistant of 15 years. He was technically the sanctuary's veterinary technician, but had become much more, a dear friend and increasingly her right hand as age made certain tasks more challenging. Daphne raised her walking stick in acknowledgement without turning. She preferred these morning walks alone, savoring the stillness before the day's work began. The sanctuary housed 12 permanent residents, bobcats, lynxes, and the occasional mountain lion that couldn't be returned to the wild, and usually had another 8 to 10 animals in various stages of rehabilitation. The sun climbed higher as she made her way along the familiar path, casting long shadows through the ponderosa pines. It had been an unusually mild winter by Montana standards, but February could still surprise them with a blizzard. Daphne paused at a clearing that overlooked the valley below, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. This vista never failed to remind her why she'd chosen this life. The land spread out before her, 500 acres of protected wilderness that served as a buffer between the sanctuary and the encroaching development from Bozeman's outskirts. Beyond lay the jagged profiles of the Bridger Mountains, their peaks still snow-capped even as spring approached. As she stood there, memories washed over her like gentle waves. The trip to that small zoo outside Bozeman when she was just 8 years old, where she'd first locked eyes with a bobcat and felt something shift inside her. The arguments with her parents when, at 22, she turned down the prestigious Johns Hopkins Medical Scholarship to work with wildlife instead. The first time she met David Black at a conservation conference in Denver. His passion for wildcats matching her own. "Penny for your thoughts," David used to say when he'd find her lost in contemplation like this. The familiar ache of his absence squeezed her heart. 17 years together hadn't been nearly enough. The accident had been quick, black ice on a mountain road, a guardrail that failed to hold, but the aftermath stretched on endlessly. For months after his death, Daphne had questioned everything. What was the point of continuing their work without him? But the animals had needed her, and slowly, caring for them had healed something inside her. Not completely, there would always be a David-shaped hole in her heart, but enough to keep going. Enough to establish High Ridge officially as a nonprofit sanctuary dedicated primarily to bobcats and other native Montana wildcats. A rustle in the underbrush pulled Daphne from a reverie. She instinctively went still, eyes scanning the tree line. Working with wild animals for over 4 decades had taught her the value of patience and observation. Nothing moved for several long moments. Then, a flicker of movement caught her eye, the distinctive tufted ears of a bobcat appearing briefly before vanishing back into the brush. Daphne smiled to herself. Bobcat sightings around the sanctuary weren't uncommon, but they always felt like a gift. While bobcats occasionally patrolled the boundaries of the sanctuary, drawn perhaps by the scent of their captive counterparts or simply passing through on their territorial rounds, This one felt different. "Go well, friend," she murmured, turning to continue her walk. The path curved around the eastern edge of the property, where the rehabilitation enclosures were situated, far from the visitor center and daily human activity. As she walked, Daphne felt the familiar twinge in her left hip, a souvenir from a fall 3 winters ago. Dr. Mitchell kept telling her she should consider a hip replacement, but Daphne brushed off the suggestion. Surgery meant weeks away from the sanctuary, and she wasn't ready for that. Not yet. By the time she completed her circuit and approached the main buildings, the sanctuary was coming to life. 2 volunteer cars were parked in the small lot, and she could see Jesse, their education coordinator, preparing materials for a school group that would arrive later that morning. The sanctuary hosted educational programs twice weekly, teaching local children about wildlife conservation and the importance of protecting Montana's native species. "Morning, Daphne," Jesse called, her breath visible in the cold air. "Did you see the weather report? They're saying snow by tonight." "My hip's been telling me the same thing," Daphne replied with a wry smile. "Make sure the generator is fueled up, just in case." Inside the main cabin that served as both residence and headquarters, Miguel had indeed prepared coffee. The rich aroma filled the warm space, and Daphne gratefully shed her outer layers before wrapping her hands around a steaming mug. "Any problems on the perimeter?" Miguel asked, not looking up from the medication chart he was updating. "All quiet. Spotted a wild bobcat on the east ridge, though." Miguel glanced up, interest flickering across his face. "Male or female?" "Didn't get a good look. Just saw the ears." Daphne settled into her chair by the wood stove, feeling the heat begin to thaw her chilled limbs. Could have been anyone. But even as she said it, a thought nagged at her mind. There had been something about the way the bobcat moved, something vaguely familiar that she couldn't quite place. The sanctuary had been Daphne's life for so long that memories sometimes blur together. Hundreds of animals rescued, rehabilitated, released, but some stood out with crystal clarity. Kaza was one of those. They'd found him 15 years ago, a tiny, half-starved bobcat kitten, no more than 4 weeks old. A logging crew had discovered him alone in a hollow tree, no mother in sight. They'd called the sanctuary immediately, and David had driven out to collect the orphan. "He's so small," Daphne had whispered when David placed the hissing bundle of spotted fur into her gloved hands. The kitten's eyes, blue-gray and fierce despite his weakness, had fixed on her face with what seemed like indignation at his circumstances. "But he's a fighter," David had replied, gently stroking the tiny head with one finger. "See how he's still got some spirit? That's good." They named him Kaza, after the Swahili word for fierce, a nod to David's years working in wildlife conservation in Kenya before returning to his native Montana. The name had suited the little bobcat, who had rallied from near death with a determination that impressed even the sanctuary's veteran staff. Raising Kaza had been different from their usual rehabilitation cases. Most orphan bobcats came to them a bit older, already wary of humans and with some innate survival skills intact. But Kaza's extreme youth meant he needed more intensive care, bottle feeding every few hours, careful monitoring, and eventually specialized training to ensure he developed the hunting skills he would need in the wild. "We have to be so careful," Daphne had reminded the staff repeatedly. "He can't associate humans with food or comfort. Not if he's going to make it out there." But despite their careful protocols, the minimal handling, the hiding of human faces behind masks during feedings, the gradual introduction of live prey, Kaza had formed an unusual connection with Daphne. He never approached her like a pet might, never sought affection or played. But he watched her with an intensity that the other rehabilitating animals didn't show. "He's imprinted on you," Miguel had suggested once, about 6 months into Kaza's rehabilitation. Daphne had shaken her head firmly. "No, he's too independent for that. He's just observant." And she had been right. As Kaza grew, he maintained his wild nature. He hissed when approached too closely, hunted with impressive precision in his training exercises, and showed all the territorial behaviors appropriate for a young male bobcat. But still, there was that awareness, that peculiar focus on Daphne whenever she was near. David had noticed it too. "It's like he's studying you," he'd said one evening as they observed Kaza from the hidden monitoring station outside his enclosure. Learning, when Kaza turned 18 months old, healthy and skilled enough for release, Daphne had experienced a profound sense of loss that took her by surprise. They'd released dozens of rehabilitated animals before. Each departure was a bittersweet triumph. But Kaza's release had felt different. They'd chosen a remote area in the Gallatin National Forest, miles from roads and human habitation, but with ideal bobcat habitat, dense underbrush, plentiful prey, and natural shelter. David had carried the transport cage deep into the forest, with Daphne following behind, her heart heavy in her chest. When they finally opened the cage door, Kaza had hesitated, sniffing the air cautiously. Then he turned his head, his yellow-gold eyes finding Daphne's one last time. The look had lasted only seconds, but Daphne felt as though something significant had passed between them. Not affection or gratitude. Nothing so human, but a recognition, an acknowledgement. Then he was gone, a spotted shadow melting seamlessly into the forest understory. "He'll be all right," David had assured her, squeezing her hand as they hiked back to their truck. "That one was born to be wild." "I know," Daphne had replied, blinking back unexpected tears. "I just hope he remembers what we taught him." David had laughed softly. "Trust me, that cat doesn't forget anything." 2 years later, David was gone, victim to that icy mountain road and a faulty guardrail. In the depths of her grief, Daphne had sometimes found herself thinking of Kaza, wondering if he was thriving in his wild freedom, if the lessons they'd taught him had served him well. Now, 15 years since his release, Daphne rarely thought of Kaza specifically. There had been so many others since, each special in their own way, each carrying a piece of her heart into the wilderness when they left. Still, on cold mornings like this one, certain memories surfaced unbidden. "Earth to Daphne." Miguel's voice broke through her thoughts. "You're a million miles away today." She smiled apologetically. "Just remembering." Miguel nodded, understanding in his eyes. He'd joined the sanctuary a few years after David's death, but he'd heard all the stories, seen all the photographs. He knew how deeply the history of this place was etched into Daphne's soul. "The school group will be here in an hour," he reminded her. And Marissa called. "The injured lynx they found near Yellowstone is stable enough for transport. They're bringing her in this afternoon." Daphne nodded, mentally rearranging the day's tasks to accommodate the new arrival. At 73, she no longer handled the more physical aspects of animal care, but she still oversaw every admission, every treatment plan, every release decision. The sanctuary was her life's work, and though she'd begun training Jessie to eventually take over when she could no longer manage, that day had not yet come. The morning passed in a flurry of activity. The school group, 28 fourth graders from Bozeman Elementary, arrived precisely at 10, bubbling with excitement despite their teachers' attempts to maintain order. Daphne welcomed them in the Education Center, a spacious room with displays about Montana's native wildcats and the threats they faced. "Who can tell me what makes a bobcat different from your cat at home?" she asked, smiling as dozens of hands shot into the air. For the next hour, she answered questions, explained the sanctuary's work, and supervised as Jessie led small groups to the observation areas where they could safely view some of the permanent residents. The children were enthralled, especially by Samson, an elderly bobcat with one eye who had been at the sanctuary for 12 years after being rescued from an illegal exotic pet situation. "He looks so soft," one little girl exclaimed, pressing her nose against the viewing glass. "Can we pet him?" "No, honey," Daphne explained gently. "Even though Samson has lived here a long time, he's still a wild animal, not a pet. We never touch the animals unless they're sick and need our help. That's how we show them respect." The girl nodded solemnly, clearly taking this lesson to heart. These moments were what kept Daphne going, the chance to instill in a new generation the same reverence for wildlife that had shaped her own life. After the school group departed, Daphne retreated to her small office to catch up on paperwork. Grant applications never wrote themselves, unfortunately, and the sanctuary's operating costs increased every year. She was deep in concentration when a knock at her door announced Miguel's presence. "Marissa is here with the lynx," he said. She's in pretty rough shape. Hit by a car on the highway near the park entrance. Multiple fractures, possible internal bleeding. Daphne nodded grimly and followed him to the medical building. Wildlife rehabilitation was not for the faint of heart. For every success story, there were animals they couldn't save despite their best efforts. The young female lynx lay sedated on the examination table, her beautiful coat matted with blood and road grime. Dr. Ellie Chan, the veterinarian who came to the sanctuary twice weekly and for emergencies, was already assessing the damage. Good news is her spine seems intact, Dr. Chan reported. Bad news: compound fracture of the left hind leg, 3 broken ribs, and I'm concerned about her right lung. She's going to need surgery, and even then, her chances are maybe 50-50. Daphne studied the injured cat, noting her youth, probably just 2 years old, and good muscle condition before the accident. She deserves that chance, Daphne decided. Let's proceed with surgery. The next few hours were a tense blur of activity as Dr. Chan operated, with Miguel and Marissa assisting and Daphne monitoring vital signs. By the time they transferred the still unconscious lynx to a recovery enclosure, the short winter day was fading toward dusk, and fat snowflakes had begun falling, just as the weather report had predicted. You should head home before the roads get bad, Daphne told Dr. Chan as they cleaned up the surgical area. Miguel and I will monitor her overnight. Call me if anything changes, the veterinarian instructed, already pulling on her heavy coat. And Daphne, get some rest yourself. You look exhausted. Daphne waved away the concern. I'll sleep when she's stable. After Dr. Chan and Marissa had departed, Miguel insisted on making dinner. They ate simple sandwiches in the main cabin, both too tired for conversation. The snow continued falling, blanketing the sanctuary in deepening white. By the time they checked on the lynx again, still unconscious but with stable vital signs, the world outside had transformed into a winter wonderland, tree branches heavy with snow and all human sounds muffled by the thick blanket of white. I'll take first watch, Miguel offered. You get some sleep, and I'll wake you at 2. Too tired to argue, Daphne retreated to her small bedroom in the back of the cabin. She didn't bother changing out of her clothes, just kicked off her boots and lay atop the quilt, intending to rest her eyes for just a moment before properly preparing for bed. She woke with a start several hours later, momentarily disoriented in the dark room. A glance at her bedside clock showed 1:47 a.m. Something had awakened her, but it wasn't Miguel. It wasn't yet time for her shift with the injured lynx. Then she heard it again, a strange scraping sound at her window. Daphne sat up slowly, her heart suddenly pounding. The sanctuary's remote location meant they occasionally had unwelcome nighttime visitors. Not the humankind, but bears, mountain lions, or other wildlife drawn by the scent of the animals in their care. Usually, the tall perimeter fences kept larger predators out, but in deep snow, sometimes drifts formed that allowed animals to climb over. The scraping came again, followed by a soft thump against the glass. Not a bear, then too controlled, too deliberate. Careful not to make sudden movements, Daphne reached for the flashlight she kept beside her bed. The curtains were drawn across her window, preventing her from seeing what was outside. Moving quietly, she slid from the bed and approached the window, flashlight gripped tightly in her hand. In one swift motion, she pulled back the curtain and shone the light out into the snowy night. A pair of gleaming eyes reflected the beam back at her, set in the distinctive face of a bobcat perched on the narrow windowsill outside her room. The animal didn't flinch from the sudden light, didn't hiss or retreat. It simply stared at her with an unnerving, steady gaze. Daphne's breath caught in her throat. The bobcat was large for its species, a healthy male in his prime, with a characteristic spotted coat and tufted ears. A wild bobcat, not one of their residents. He must have climbed the snowdrift against the cabin wall to reach the window. But why would a wild bobcat approach a human dwelling so deliberately? As she stood frozen in confusion, the bobcat raised one paw and deliberately pressed against the glass, leaving a perfect print in the condensation that had formed there. The gesture was so unexpected, so seemingly intentional, that Daphne gasped aloud. And in that moment of shock, A possibility flashed through her mind that seemed simultaneously impossible and the only explanation. "Kaza," she whispered, her voice barely audible even to herself. At the sound, the bobcat's ears twitched forward. He tilted his head slightly, eyes never leaving hers. Then he placed his paw against the glass once more, holding it there as